Nor is the current president.
I was going to say Barack Obama is the president.
Yes.
Glib egomaniac. How bad has he been? Where does Barack Obama rank in your mind, you who know so much history, among the worst American presidents?
He has displaced Jimmy Carter from that position.
The worst.
The worst.
Worse than James Buchanan.
Yes.
Worse than Richard Nixon.
Yes.
All right.
Richard Nixon did not, after all, put us in danger of nuclear attacks, probably within the lifetime of people living today.
The Iran deal will do that.
Yes.
All right.
We're committed to stopping the Israelis from stopping the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon. That's part of the deal.
Barack Obama, in August of last year, quote, "In the first 100 days of my administration, I will travel to a major Islamic forum and deliver an address to redefine our struggle. I will make clear that we will stand with those who are willing to stand up for their future and that we need their efforts to defeat the prophets of hate and violence." Close quote. What do you make of those two?
I think Barack Obama has a lot more faith in verbal interactions than I would. What he's proposing under the guise of change is what has been tried for 2 decades between the two world wars, and which failed disastrously in helping to bring on the Second World War.
Barack Obama's plan for defense spending as of last year, I'm quoting his speech, "I'll stop spending $9 billion a month in Iraq. I will cut tens of billions in wasteful spending. I will cut investments in unproven missile defense systems. I will not weaponize space. I will slow our development of future combat systems, and I will institute an independent defense priorities board to avoid unnecessary spending." Close quote.
Well, that's straight out of the 30s. There were people who were saying Britain should not. The British Labour Party in the early to mid-30s voted consistently against defense spending, and they argued that our security does not depend on armaments, but on disarmaments. And so when Chamberlain went to Munich to talk to Hitler, it wasn't just his own party, the conservatives, who applauded him when he came back. It was the Labour and liberals as well. He was probably the most lionized man among Western leaders, perhaps, of the past century.
You mentioned the, I think you would call it a naive view of world affairs, that he places a great deal of faith in rhetoric, the ability of rhetoric to solve global problems. This reminds you of the 1930s. It reminds you of Neville Chamberlain. Yeah. I read you a quotation of the notion of spreading the wealth around, and again, you said that's perfectly pure socialist doctrine from the 1930s. Would you argue that this man is the most left-wing, or the purest embrace of the unconstrained vision that we've seen in American politics since when? Since the New Deal?
Since the Great Society? In American politics.
Really?
Yes. Yes. I mean, even FDR, pulled back on some things. But Obama really, he does have the unconstrained vision, which is really an elitist vision. It says, I know what is the best to be done, and I will do it. When he says, I will change the world, you realize this is a man who has actually accomplished nothing other than advancing his career through rhetoric. And it reminds me of a sophomore in college, who thinks that he can run the world because he's never had to run anything. And you can believe that only until you have personal responsibility for consequences. And that's when it gives you a little bit of humility.
Why don't the American people see through that? Isn't that the fundamental bet that the founders made, that that voters would see through, ultimately they'd see through nonsense?
Yes, but that was before nonsense became a large part of the curriculum of our educational institutions.
I was talking about this with a colleague of ours the other day, Tom McCurdy, who's an economist here at the Hoover Institution, and Tom said, well, remember what happened when Bill Clinton became president. His point is the American people are about to get an extreme illustration of the way government intervention messes things up. Bill Clinton offered only a mild illustration, and yet even under Bill Clinton, it was only 2 years before there was enough of a backlash response that Republicans took both houses of Congress away, and the man was boxed in from that point forward. That's a pretty optimistic reading of what might happen. In fact,
very optimistic.
Very optimistic.
Yes, because there is such a thing as a point of no return, and if in those first 2 years Iran gets nuclear weapons, we will be at that point of no return, and the next generation will live under that same threat and as far out as the eye can see. And so, sometimes people who are very clever say it's just as well to let these guys get in there and discredit themselves.
Right.
Then we'll win on the backlash. People said that when Hitler was arising in Germany, and many of those people who said that died in the concentration camps. Which is a smaller tragedy than a nation dying in a sense.
Before the primaries had ended, you wrote, Hillary Clinton versus John McCain. I wouldn't know whether to vote Libertarian or move to Australia. Now we know it's Barack Obama versus John McCain. You'll vote for John McCain, but hold your nose. What's your fundamental?
Yes, the difference is the Clintons had the saving grace of utter lack of principle, which meant that when they saw which way the political winds were blowing, that's the way they'd go, regardless of what they'd been saying before. This man has been a far-left ideologue for 20 years, and not just a matter of ideology. I mean, people who are truly vile people. We're not talking about just people who have a certain theory.
Bill Ayers.
I mean, Acorn. I'm talking thuggery as the way to get your ideas across. Father Flagel. You go down the list. I judge people by what they've done, not by what they say, particularly when what they say is the direct opposite of what they've done. So that, no, I think this man really does believe that he can change the world. And people like that are infinitely more dangerous than mere crooked politicians.
Final question. Let's suppose that the Wall Street Journal is right. Let's suppose that Barack Obama wins and that the Democrats increase their majorities in both the House and the Senate. Let's suppose all of that. What would be your advice to young people dedicated to free markets, individual liberty, and broadly speaking to the constrained vision that you write about in A Conflict of Visions? What do you do if something like this happens?
You do whatever you find you can do under those conditions, which you can only learn by experience. But it's a little like saying, what advice do you give to someone on death row when they come to take them down to the gas chamber?
Again, intellectuals in society, there is a spontaneous demand from the larger society for the end products of engineering, medical, and scientific professions, but the demand for public intellectuals is largely manufactured by the public intellectuals themselves.
Yes.
Explain that. How do they manufacture demand for their own services?
Well, one thing is by making alarming predictions, offering solutions to our problems. And if they didn't do that, if Noam Chomsky had just kept on stating in linguistics, neither of us probably would have ever heard of Noam Chomsky. He would have been just as famous around the world among linguists, but nobody else would have heard of him.
What do you make of global warming?
I think it's a classic example of the need for crusades. Now, many people are shocked by these emails. I'm not at all shocked by them. I read the original UN study years ago, and I was just curious as to how they were going to deal with the question that the temperatures went up first, and then there was the increase in carbon dioxide.
Right.
Because you can't say that A causes B if B happened first. And so I read this, and I could see they were tiptoeing through the tulips and the way they phrased things and so forth. They couldn't confront that. And now we're finding out that they knew darn well they couldn't deal with all the evidence.
So it fits the pattern of a group of intellectuals, climate scientists who have a very narrow competency, suddenly proclaiming that there's a crisis, scaring the rest of us, thereby creating a demand for their services,
Yes.
not as climate scientists alone, but as a kind of high priestly caste that can tell us all how to live and save the entire
Yes.
planet, and in the meantime generate billions of dollars worth of government programs to fund their research initiatives. And so it's a racket.
Yes.
All right.
But again, you have to take account of the ability of human beings to rationalize. I'm sure there are scientists out there who believe some or much of what they're saying, and there are other scientists who believe the opposite. But the ones who are pushing global warming are doing their damnedest to make sure that those who believe the opposite don't get heard in the public.
So shouldn't there be some large-ish body of climate scientists who say the data really does suggest that we're headed into trouble here, but precisely because my saying so as a climate scientist will look like special pleading, we as a community of scientists should be even more careful about being completely transparent, pushing the data out to the public. They should overcome the hurdle that it looks like self-pleading. Why isn't that taking place?
There's no payoff to that.
All right.
Imagine yourself as an assistant professor in some department where your senior colleagues who are going to vote on your pay, among other things, have millions of dollars in grants handed out to promote global warming, and you say just what you just now said. And they all say, this guy is incorrigible.